Now let's try and elucidate what an analytical framework is and look at a few examples of such frameworks. A clear explanation of your analytical framework will demonstrate that your account of data is not random. In other words, this big term, analytical framework, means the method through which you analyze your data. It basically means you're not doing it intuitively, but that you have a scientific method behind it. It consists of techniques and methods used for analysis, and what is quite important is that you use the labels relevant to each method. For example, discourse analysis if it is qualitative data analysis, and statistical analysis if you deal with numbers. There are tools, as in software, for processing your data. SPSS is a widely known one for statistical analysis, whereas NVivo is one we sometimes use for discourse analysis. Now, more often than not, it's the numerical data, the quantitative data, which is analyzed through a software rather than the qualitative data. Having said that, when you end up with massive amount of data from interviews, it may make more sense to use a software to analyze it. So that would be NVivo. The decisions that may determine you to use one analytical framework or another are given by two issues. One is the prevailing paradigm in the field. What I mean by that is that if in your literature review you've realized that statistical analysis is mostly used by scholars in your field, it may make sense that you try and use the same. However, if you're doing a qualitative research based on interviews and interpretations of those interviews, it will make very little sense to use statistical analysis at all. So it is given by, on the one hand, what the others before you did, and on the other hand, the nature of your data. I personally think that the second one is a lot more powerful than the first one. Now, let's discuss two basic examples of such frameworks. One is statistical analysis and the other is discourse analysis. For statistical analysis, the definition comes from Ferguson, amongst others. Ferguson are not the only one who came up with a definition for statistical analysis, but this one comes from him. It's not a word-by-word definition though. So it is a scientific method of analysis consisting of data collation, classification, description, and interpretation. And this data is collected through questionnaires and experiments. Basic concepts you should master before you embark onto statistical analysis are: first, the difference between population and sample. Population is the entire amount of that particular kind. So the population of the country is everyone in that country, and a typical survey of an entire population of a country you can find in a census. So census data, which is collected every few years, and most countries, I would imagine, or most Western countries, definitely. Now, a sample is not the entire population, is an example of that population. So, in other words, the immediate thought goes to a representative example of that population. So if we talk about a sample of universities, we would think to include in that sample all sort of universities, not only research universities, or not only ancient universities, or not only new universities. You would probably have a sample of each kind. Now a sample can be random or a convenience sample, or a range of other types of samples, but these are the two extreme types, random and convenience. A random one can generate generalizable conclusions, in other words, conclusions about the sample which could be transferred to the population. So if the conclusion based on a study of a university sample says, for example, that university leadership depends on, let's just choose something at random, on gender, then we would only be able to generalize that finding to the entire population of universities if the random of universities we looked at in our study was random. Now, if the sample was a convenience sample, which means that we looked at universities to which we had access, the findings would not be generalizable to the whole population of universities. So note of caution: population doesn't necessarily mean population of people. It can mean population of the category of which the sample is just an example of. Another concept you should master at this point is that of variable. Now, we discussed variables in our very first lecture, so I invite you to go back to that lecture and brush on that knowledge. But for these purposes, I'd like to mention that the variable is a characteristic of the sample, or a characteristic of the population. So for example, gender is a variable. Gender can be male, female, or why not unassigned. So these are variables. The variables can be of many different types, but just as an example of that typology, can be dependent or independent. Now, if you remember how we learned to formulate research aims as the, for example, impact of A on B in the context of C, A in that example would be the independent variable. B would be the dependent variable, because B is dependent on the A's impact, if you wish. But there are a lot of other typologies associated with variables, and if statistical analysis is what you need, what you should do is take a good book on statistical analysis and follow it almost step by step in your data analysis. You will probably not need to worry about this until the summer, and it isn't something that we will assess in this course. So this is just to sort of get you started and get you thinking about what you may be doing in the summer, with the primary aim of you being able to predict what you might be doing in the summer through your research proposal, which is the assessment in this course. Now, we've already established that statistics are used with quantitative data, and they're used for two purposes: description, using descriptive statistics, in other words, just looking at the sample and trying to describe it by way of referring to variables. So perhaps if it's people, if it's a sample of people, perhaps gender, age, I don't know, socio-economic demographics, that sort of things. So that is one purpose for which we would use statistics, and another would be prediction. Just try to foresee what aspects of the sample would be replicated in the entire population. It can be, again, of two kinds. We like referring to typologies, types, kinds in academia. So again, with two types, probabilistic and non-probabilistic. So if the sample is small, you probably need to do a non-probabilistic statistical analysis, also referred to as non-parametric. And if the sample is large enough, and just exactly what large means sort of depends on your area of research. For example, consumer research is infamous for very, very large samples. I think it is close to 200, the threshold for probabilistic statistical analysis. So if this is the field in which you wish to do research and you wish to do a numerical study, you'll probably need to collect about 200 questionnaires, which isn't easy. But again, all you will have to worry about is secondary data, and secondary data can be of quite large samples, so you would be able to use probabilistic analysis there. But if not, and not typically means under 60 respondents, you would do a non-parametric analysis. In SPSS there is simply another button, a different button for non-parametric or non-probabilistic analysis. You simply press that and see what the drop-down menu suggests you could do with it. In terms of steps, if you wish, for statistical analysis, there are three basic steps. One is data preparation, the other is descriptive statistics, and the third one is inferential statistics. Data preparation has to do with you logging the data, checking for accuracy, entering the data in the software if applicable. Here is an example of data inserted in SPSS. It is a little bit blurred, but I think you can get the gist. Now, if data is inserted in an Excel file, it would look something similar to this. Descriptive statistics are used to describe the data gathered, as we mentioned before. Here is an example of how this might be done. So just in this dissertation here, in the findings section, you'll find the first subsection of the findings being descriptive statistics. So the student is describing the sample, okay, with minimum and maximum values, mean and standard deviation, okay, and then moves on to correlation, so inferential statistics. Okay, again, when the time comes, grab yourselves a good book on statistical analysis and just follow the steps one by one. Okay, now let's move on to discourse analysis. So, an analytical framework for qualitative data. Here, we don't take discourse to mean the spoken word, although I am about to show you an example that consists just of that. But discourse can be understood as any written or spoken communication. There I have removed the more abstract terms. Discourse is constructed according to socio-cultural, political, and ideological values. So, in other words, the meaning of the words being used in that communication, be it written or spoken, depend on such things, and in particular, it depends on where it was used, as in the country, the geographical area, by whom, to whom. So all these issues are important. In a sense, you could conclude that the researcher's interpretation depends on their familiarity with the context in which the discourse took place. And again, discourse does not necessarily mean verbal communication. Variants of discourse analysis, in other words, alternatives to discourse analysis, if you are to use qualitative data, include content analysis, thematic analysis, sentiment analysis, discourse psychology, and critical discourse analysis. Content analysis is a more well-known variant of discourse analysis, but caution, content analysis is actually a quantitative analysis of qualitative data. So you're moving towards the mixed methodology if you are to use content analysis. But very often people think they do content analysis, but they actually mean discourse analysis. But they use content analysis because they assume discourse analysis is only for verbal communication, which isn't the case. Having said that, I do have a verbal communication to show you by way of example. So it is from a research exploring how solidarity is formed during industrial action, case of UK miners' strikes, and it goes like something like this.
George Cairns, former miner, former mayor of Newcastle too, and spent a lot of your life here in Newcastle. George, you name, as I said, George Cairns, but you also Georgie Rex. Where did that?
Now, the continuation will not interest you undoubtedly, but I'm just using it as a hypothetical example of a research which you might do, which I'm sure you won't because it's not in management. But it is an example of a secondary data found in an archive right here. And do you email me if archival research is something that interests you? So if archives represent a source for secondary data in your books, I can direct you to the right people. So this researcher used this archive, the British Library Archive, found the file and looked at it to explore this research aim here. Now, first step to do with discourse analysis is to get a transcription of the audio file. And this is why discourse analysis does not only apply to audio files, it applies to text, okay? So this is the first step. Now, what I would like you to do in your discussion forum is look at this particular paragraph and try to identify 3 emerging themes from this text. In other words, if you were to tell somebody about what was said here and you could only use 3 words, what would the 3 words be? Just try to summarize it. Just add 3 headings. Okay? Do that in the discussion forum, just following this video, and then we will continue with the next video.